Hey everyone, and welcome to this round glass review for the Canon FD 200mm f2.8 S.S.C. That stands for Super Spectra Coatings. And that's a coating that is applied to the elements throughout the lens to increase light transmission and improve contrast. S.S.C. is simply Canon's branding for multi-coating in the same way that Pentax called theirs SMC or super multi-coated, etc. Is S.S.C. anything much more super spectacular than any of the others that were available at the time? I've heard some people say yes, and I've heard some people say no. Usually the Canon fans say yes, and the people who like other brands say no. Honestly, they're probably pretty darn close to the same. Anyway, this lens was made from 1975 to 1979 in this iteration. Now, the 200-2.8 lenses, I don't have the exact time frame that they were available written down, but there was at least an SC version that predated this one, and then various optical designs were made up until the 90s. I think 93 or 95 was the last, either the last release or the discontinuation, I forget which, of the Canon EF 200mm 2.8. And I don't think, someone will correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but I am completely unaware of a 200mm f2.8 prime made by Canon after that last EOS EF lens that was made in the mid-90s. Typical uses for a 200mm lens include some portrait work, though this is a personal aesthetic perspective. 200mm does tend to be a bit on the long side for 35mm portraits. 200mm lenses, however, are very good for birds and wildlife, sports, trains, can stay safely far away from the trains, car races, same thing, and basically anything else that you can get kinda close to, but you don't really want to be in harm's way. So for your bottom line up front, this lens holds up today on full frame, but it struggles on APS-C. Now that's primarily in terms of sharpness, by the way. On full frame, it has great colors and contrast and good sharpness. On APS-C and by extension smaller formats, it will exhibit enlargement softness that exacerbates the lens's handful of weaknesses. Your focal length and angle of view are 200mm and 12.3 degrees on full frame or 35mm film, 300mm and 8.2 degrees on APS-C. The aperture range is 2.8 to 22. The element and group count are 5 and 5. The design type is telephoto. Filter size 72mm. Closest focus is 1.8 meters, which in the US is still 1.8 meters, but we call it 0.008947773 furlongs. It is a manual focus lens. The native mount is Canon FD. The dimensions are 140.5 by 78 millimeters, and it weighs in at a somewhat front-heavy 700 grams. This lens will color fringe, especially purple and magenta fringing, in areas with stark contrast changes. This can be mitigated to a decent extent by underexposing your images slightly. The fringing is substantially increased when the image is overexposed, for instance if you're using spot metering to photograph a dark bird in a sky. Phototypes that are easiest to achieve successfully with this lens include wildlife of birds and animals that are close-ish. And what I mean is that the small birds in these images were between 10 and 50 feet away, give or take. The raptors were flying above some old trees. The zoo animals throughout this video were zoo animal distance, which is, I guess, anywhere from 10 to 20 meters. The subjects that should almost definitely not be taken with this lens include portraits. Asterisk, I know this is a personal aesthetic preference. There are probably people who would say, I use 200mm for portraits all the time and they're amazing, and they may well be amazing photos. No argument, just a choice. I don't really like going beyond 150mm at most on full frame or 35mm for portraits. Anyway, that's as a general statement. that it's not great for portraits because longer focal length lenses tend to make people's features look flat due to long lens image compression. So this lens can be used for portraits. And yes, there are definitely going to be examples of this lens having been used quite well for portraits. But honestly, there are better options for portraits, such as, like I said, anything from the 150 millimeter range on the long end to, say, 75 millimeters on the short end. That's really the portrait sweet spot. Anyway, for metering, any of the standard metering modes will work well with this lens, and the light loss that it exhibits did not affect metering at all with any of them. I would say in general, when I tested it, full matrix or whatever Sony calls it, I don't remember, and center weighted were returning meter readings that were exactly the same in the same lighting. So that should just tell you that the light loss doesn't affect meter readings at all with this lens. A good technique for this lens with sports and moving subjects is pre-focusing, and that's because it's a manual focus lens. And what that involves is anticipating where the action will be, which could be very easy for sports. For example, if you're sitting where there's a turn at a rally car race, or if you pre-focus at the hoop in basketball, well, just focus there and then wait for the action to arrive. You're going to use your shooting eye to keep your framing and focus, and your non-shooting eye to track the action as it approaches, and that way you can start your photos in burst mode just before the action arrives and have a good chance of 1 or 2 photos from that series turning out well. This is a 5.5 design, and as I understand it, each of the optics in the lens is coated with Canon's superspectra coating system. That's the S.S.C, as we talked about earlier. Canon has always had a pretty good marketing team, and back when S.S.C coatings were the hot new thing, their marketing team pushed them hard. Are they any better than competitor multi-coating systems of the time? I recall reading an article that tested that and found they were equivalent, or maybe very slightly worse, but not in any noticeable way, but that the difference between the coating systems of all of the different makers of the time was sort of like the difference between a 5-liter engine and a 5.00003-liter engine. Sure, those added zeros and the 3 are more, but really, who cares? The S.S.C multi-coating system is good, and honestly, I can't tell a difference between how this lens performs and how the coatings on an FDN lens performs. So yeah, I guess the TLDR for this whole diagram section is S.S.C coatings with only 5 elements make this a pretty good lens. Breathing is apparent from closest focus to 2.5 meters, which is a throw of 0.7 meters when looking at 2 still images. In video use with 16:9 crop and a slow enough transition, breathing could be masked in video by movement and action. The aperture is strongly stepped in half-stop increments. The front element is non-rotating, but it does move in and out approximately 30 millimeters, which is about 15% of the lens's focal length. Focus throw is about 290 degrees. The focus ring is very wide and easily gripped, but it does move in and out slightly as the lens is focused. Focus damping, noting that this will vary by lens age, use, and care, is very nice on mine, and this lens handles exceptionally well. Focus ring play is non-existent, and the autofocus effect on audio is not applicable, as this is a manual focus lens and has no autofocus motor. Sharpness is good on full frame when you use most or all of the frame. This lens struggles on APS-C, and we can assume by extension on a micro four thirds. The enlargement factor on those smaller sensors amplifies this lens's flaws. Build quality is exceptional in keeping with Canon FD lenses. The lens is solid, it has no flex in the system at all, and everything on it handles beautifully and smoothly. Now, that said, the aperture ring feels like a cheesy afterthought, and though the detents are distinct, the aperture ring on mine likes to shoot past them, and it doesn't feel as solid as the rest of the lens. That could be partly due to age and use. Contrast is a bit ho-hum on the raw files, and using automatic contrast correction in post can throw contrast into the wildly unpalatable arena very quickly, especially with bird and plane photography, as those tend to have large swaths of sky in them. To get the most out of this lens in terms of contrast, shoot raw, edit in RAW, and adjust the sliders judiciously. In raster editing, always duplicate your layer and then dial back the transparency or adjust the blend type when you correct for contrast. Out of focus areas are exceptional wide open and stopped down slightly. Stopped down to f7 and slower, they can become jittery, especially with busy backgrounds. Distortion is functionally non-existent, and this test shows some honestly very remarkable performance. The near imperceptible pincushion in the very centers of the edge axes is completely unnoticeable in real-world use. Light loss performance is commendable, with minor loss at f2.8 and f4, and no loss that I can see from 5.6 through 22. Flare and ghosting are unknown, as I was unable to achieve either in the 3 years that I used this lens. Now that said, I also exclusively use this lens with a slide-out hood in place, and I recommend that you do that too. The lens hood combined with the coatings will do a great deal to ensure that this lens does not flare or ghost. Balance with cameras is good by long lens and telephoto standards. It's too much for small cameras, but for large full-frame mirrorless bodies and also for SLRs, it feels pretty good. Lens designers suffer from an inclination that I call maximum glass. This lens has 5 elements. Just 20 years later, the same spec Canon EF lens had 9. And since that lens, Canon hasn't, that I've found, ever made a prime 200mm f2.8. Their EOS are 70 to 200mm 2.8, which is it's not fair. It's not a fair comparison, but it's the closest thing really specification-wise that I could find to this in their modern lineup. Well, that lens has a staggering 17 elements in it. So what does that extra glass and weight and cost get you? Reduced chromatic aberrations, certainly, and that is a noticeable benefit. Better sharpness at the corners? Yeah, probably. Better performance on digital? Sure. Less flaring and ghosting without a lens hood? Yeah, probably, but that's likely why this lens included a slide-out lens hood. A noticeable image quality bump on the social media posts? No. Print quality that's so much better it would be noticeable on anything smaller than 2 feet by 3 feet? Unlikely. The benefits that modern lens designs bring can often be rectified in post with decent raw processing in about 5 minutes when using a vintage lens. Is the added cost and weight of all that glass worth shaving 5 minutes off your editing time following each shoot? Well, that's up to you. Back in the day, lenses were designed to be lighter and to still perform well, and lenses like this do. Lenses like this are the case that many of the old lens design ideals were better than many of the modern lens design ideals. You may not be here yet, but you likely will be someday. I am at a point where carrying 12 fewer lens elements is the difference between whether or not my morning routine is sitting up right away and then going to get coffee, or sitting up slowly over the span of 20 or so minutes while making noises that have Steinbeck, my dog, reaching for the phone to dial 911. Look, weight matters. And if the trade-off of an old lens with some readily correctable issues versus a new lens without them is how much pain I'm in for the 2 days after a long hike with that latter lens, I will take the old lens, please, and thank you. Every piece of camera gear is a chance to learn, to teach oneself a new way to frame or compose an image, to find new subjects that weren't readily attainable before, or to experiment with different types of photos. And every piece of old camera lens design can teach modern lens engineers something that they would do well to learn. There is a great benefit to a simple lens with fewer elements and less weight. And if the trade-off is one or more mild, readily corrected, higher-order flaws, so be it. Lenses are meant to be carried, not lifted repeatedly whilst chugging chalky creatine shakes. And this 200mm f2.8, you know what? It carries well and it delivers stunning results.